Start off with this. Why did I actually even do the first edition of this talk? I was invited to a conference in Vancouver a couple of months ago, and the theme of the conference was space, time, and pedagogy. Sorry, space and pedagogy. And I said, space and pedagogy, what am I going to talk about when I talk about space and pedagogy? And that's where I started thinking, so how do we conceptualize space? What do we mean by space? How do we think of space in relation to pedagogy? Is it simply when we talk about a space, we're looking at things like how much room we have? Do we only think about in terms of where it is, whether it's online or whether it's on site, whether we have sort of resources, or is there more to looking at space than just that? And is looking at space in relation to language, how does it relate to society and our conceptions of language and education? So that's where it starts from, and let's see where it takes us. So as I said, it's still a work in progress, but I think there are things that are coming out which are quite interesting, at least for me. So the first thing to say is, what is a space, and how do we understand space in relation to language? So if I were to ask you, what are some of the word classes that we use to identify or describe space? You will answer probably things like, we can say nouns, right? Nouns describe places, they identify places, like the beach, Sydney. You have adverbials, here, there, which identify space. There are prepositions which relate one object to another in relation to space. And there are adjectives, right? There are large, long, which describe space. So we can see how language is used to create an understanding of space. Now we can also do that with time. And now the reason I want to combine time, of course, is in physics, space and time are not two different things. But in language, in our conception of the world, they are. And is that because we see also time in relation to, for example, using nouns, using adverbials, using prepositions, and using adjectives, right? So now when you look at these things, when we look at space and when we look at time, and the ways that we use language, at least English here, other languages are different, but in English, we use nouns, adverbials, prepositions, adjectives to describe time and describe space and to identify space and time. Now what this leads us to is essentially thinking of space-time as material, right? Because nouns we see as concrete, we look at places, at specific places. So when we're looking at space-time in relation to language, through language, we're thinking of space-time as something that is material. Space is here and space is there, it's material. And we think of it and understand it in the same way. Now, to realize that materiality, we think of the five senses, right? So you have the five senses, which are sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. So these kids here playing can see the dessert that they're eating. They're talking to each other and they have the sound of the food and the noise that they're in. They can smell the food, they can touch it, they can taste it, right? So the five senses help us to navigate the material space that we work in. Okay, so notice there's actually a hierarchy. The way that I've ordered it, sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste, is a very specific way of ordering it. It's a hierarchy. And I'll just explain it, I can explain it in many different ways, but think about it in terms of personal relationships. There are so many people around here, but you don't know everybody. Even though if you look around, you can see them, right? Just look around. Can you see people? Lots of people, right? Lots of people. But simply because somebody is present, we acknowledge them as other people, we don't necessarily know them, we don't have a relationship with them. It's when we start speaking with them, which is sound, we start to develop some kind of a relationship with them, right? But it's actually when we start moving towards getting close to people, you can smell them, right? And if you smell them and you don't like them, you will walk away, right? So in a sense, the sense of smell impacts our relationships. But then if you know somebody, and in certain cultures it's okay to touch people, right? Touching, but other cultures it's not. But in terms of touch, it shows some level of intimacy as well. But it is taste that's the most intimate in human relationships. Because you might see everybody, definitely not going to taste everybody. So we can see that there's actually a hierarchy in these senses. And, and we use all these 5 senses all the time to navigate everywhere we are. I can explain this in terms of how we survive and other things. The hierarchy works quite well. Sight and sound can sometimes be reversed, but they are both equally crucial. And of course, when people don't have one of these senses, they have to compensate for it through other senses. Okay? So if somebody cannot see, they will use other senses to navigate the world. It doesn't stop them from doing things. It just means that the systems that they use are different, and they're configured differently. Now, where is language in all of it? Language actually just operates through aspects of sight and aspects of sound. And this is one of the problems I feel with linguistics as a discipline in how we reduce language to just texts, whether they're written texts or oral texts. And very often we put the writing systems and the sounds, writing and sound, or spoken and written, as 2 continuum of language, as modes. I find that as a fallacy. And I think that's really restricting in what we can achieve in linguistics. The reason it's a fallacy is because written text works through the sight system. It's visual. And oral language works through sound systems. It's a different system. It's a different sensory system. Okay? Just like smell, touch, and taste. Smell, touch, and taste, we don't really use language. But of course, language refers to that. And we use them metaphorically. So written and oral is not necessarily a continuum. They're actually 2 different sense types. And perhaps we need to think of others as well. But anyway, coming back to pedagogy, right? So we've got the material world, we understand how language works materially, and then we can think about how material space relates to pedagogy. So we can look at a class in Uganda, we can see that kids are sitting under a tree, there's a lot of outside interference, and of course the space in which this learning is happening is going to impact the kind of learning that happens, right? We know this sort of stuff. I can give you an example of a class from Pakistan, a class in Canada, and perhaps an online class, right? In each case, the space is different. And the space tells us that there is a different sort of pedagogy that's happening. People are teaching and learning in different ways, in different contexts. They're learning different things. And of course, that impacts what happens and what kind of learning they end with. And that impacts the future trajectories. But so far, essentially, I'm talking about this only in terms of nouns, adjectives, adverbials, prepositions, and things. What about verbs? When I say something like I'm thinking, right? Or imagining. Imagining is where does that take us? We now know that if we think of these verbs at different categories, if I say I was running versus I was thinking, I was running is quite material, but I was thinking is not that material, right? So now we start seeing contrasts, very clear contrasts in how the verb systems, even in English, can tell us how different ways of conceptualizing the world and space vary, right? So there's a space, when you say when I'm running, there's a physical space that you're running through. But when you say I'm imagining, there's no physical space that you're imagining, right? It's more internal. So there's something that's essentially happening just within you. Now this is a second thing that I'll come back and talk to you about in a bit, but we can think about verbs in different ways, and we can think about verbs, how are verbs studied in different ways of studying linguistics, right? So linguistics is not a unified field in the sense that we all use just a single theory or a single grammar. There are various different ways of studying language, and they all have evolved in trying to answer different kinds of questions about language. So it's not a question of what grammar is better or worse. It's a question of what are the kind of questions that you're asking, and what sort of descriptions or explanations of language work better for you, and then adapting them and using them in certain ways. So when I look at verbs, I find, especially looking at in terms of space, I find drawing on SFL quite useful, especially focusing on the process types. So SFL doesn't use the term verbs, they use processes. And the process types, I like them because they are essentially looking at things like material process, mental process, relational process, and you can see things like running, dissolving, stirring are material processes. That's the notion of the material space connecting it. But then we also have a clear set of mental processes, which things like seeing, forgetting, liking, which are not material in the same way as running or stirring. So there are other ways of creating grammars and looking at categorizing language and which tell us different things about space. So no longer are we restricted to material space, which adjectives and nouns tell us, but we can start talking about semiotic space. Okay? And I think this is extremely important when we think of space and pedagogy, because it's not simply about where people are learning. It's about the very meanings that they create or learn to create through language, because that is the enabler. It isn't that a person learns under the tree. It is the semiotic understanding of the world that it either empowers them or restricts them. So we need to think of semiotic space, not just material space. We perhaps spend too much time looking at material space. How many number of students are you allowed to have in a class, right? Like in a rooms, what is square meters? If you look at some of the accreditation policies for education around the world, they specify the square footage, how much square foot of a space must you have for each student. Now that's material space. But within the same accreditation documentation, they never talk about semantic space, as if that's not important. And I'm going to argue that semantic space, when it comes to pedagogy, is way more important than material space. And we need to think about how semiotic space needs to be understood. Now, this is where I'm going into areas which I'm still struggling with thinking about, but I'm happy to share them with you. And perhaps I would love to hear back from you to see what you think about these things and how we can take them further, or if we need to take them further. So I would say that semiotic space may be understood in terms of two things. One, it's sensory systems or sensory modes that are used to connect to the world around us. So colors, language, symbols, art, music, touch, smells, all of these things. These are the sensory systems and the sensory modes. There's a distinction between system and mode. System is the sensory system itself, and the mode are the various ways in which that system operates. So when we say the visual system, then we can think of visual systems being text, being color, being a movement, being expressions, being emotions, gestures, all of that. It combines because that's all visual. Text, the written text is just one part of the visuals, right? So of course, one sensory system interacts with other as well. So there's a different set of sensory systems. And of course, there are social systems that are used to interpret, understand, and respond to these sensory systems. That's why we are all different, right? We're not the same, even though we are biologically the same, we are not the same semiotically and semantically. Because the way that we interpret, understand, and respond to the sensory systems are different. Now, my colleagues in multimodality analysis will argue that not only is this appropriate, but we can actually train people to gaze at the world in certain ways. So you can actually train people to look for certain forms or features or certain patterns in certain ways, and they will focus on those in those ways. And that's where our educational systems are so powerful. By creating the curriculum and the textbooks and the text and the syllabus that we use in our programs, we are actually controlling that semiotic space, because we are teaching our children how to interpret, understand, and respond to the various sensory inputs that we get. Okay? So we get these sensory inputs, and we need to understand how we do that. So then semiotic systems relate to other semiotic systems. They're not just one, they work trans-semiotically in making meaning. So for example, if I were to walk from here up to the exit sign, there is all 5 sorts of systems, sensory systems make me do that, right? And how do we work through this? So going back to this little image of the children doing these things, it isn't just that they are doing things in the material world. There is also stuff happening semantically, semiotically, stuff happening inside them, their brains. They're thinking, they're doing things. right? And we want to understand not just that materiality, but also the semiotics. So the material space and the semiotic space. They're not separated out, they are sort of the yin and yang, right? So the semiotic and the material, as far as we are concerned, are the same. And this is the second point that I said earlier, I'll make later on. And I think this is very crucial, and I think this is also a critique somewhat of the dominant forms of linguistics that we do. And the critique is this, and I'll pose it as a question. Think of any kind of grammar that you might be familiar with, any kind of linguistic descriptions that you're familiar with, or theories of grammars that you're familiar with. Of course, we understand that when we theorize language or we write grammars, very often in all this theorization, there's no central theorization of a person. It's that grammar and language and text exists. Yeah, they do exist, right? There is text. And we can analyze the text and we can look for the patterns in those texts. But that understanding and interpretation of the text is independent of the people, of the person who does that work, right? So if language doesn't exist outside you, if I don't exist, my language doesn't exist. It's very much who you are. And yet when we describe languages, we think of them as objects that we can analyze, objectively as entities, abstract entities that can be looked at and described in terms of patterns or rules or whatever that might be. I would argue that our central place of our discussion or argumentation or theorization of language needs to begin with the person. It is the person that we need to look at, and then look at how language is part of that. And not just that, but part of a set of semiotic systems. So the material and the semiotic space, material and semiotic is combined together in all of us. Each one of us here. Okay? Each one of you is material, right? There are no ghosts in the room that I can see at least. And all of you are semiotic. You're thinking beings, right? It is the combination that makes you. And so, how do we theorize an understanding of language that combines it? And why do we need to do that? We need to do that because if we look at text and grammar as independent of the person, then we are creating descriptions of language that are not about us. It's about something different. That's why we can create prescriptive rules of grammar that we want everybody to learn. And I'll tell you that, coming from Pakistan, my English will never be like a British or American. Never be. And why should it be? Right? Why should it be? It doesn't need to be. But if I'm being taught that grammar is this and this and this, and that English requires this, and that teachers tell me if I don't do it this way, then my English is incorrect. Right? If I keep getting this negative evaluation based on some criteria of description of an object, which is language, which is based on descriptions and analysis that are not grounded in a person, then how valid and useful are those for what I need to achieve? Don't those descriptions of grammar disempower us rather than empower us? So thinking about this in ways of how the material and semiotic spaces are the same, and they are the person that we are. Okay? There's nothing independent of it. Then what is language? Language, from how I see it, is an interface between the material and semantic spaces. And that's what function it serves us. It gives us a way of understanding and relating how material and semiotic spaces interact with each other. Right? Because I'm thinking, but as I'm thinking, my hand is moving, because it's showing you when I move my hand like this. In many cultures, what does that mean? That means somebody's thinking, something is happening, right? That movement. And many of you will interpret it. But you're not just seeing the movement or the gesture, you're also listening. So there's a physical element to what I'm thinking, which is being verbalized through oral language, through images, through text, and coming together. So as audience members in this room, you get the physical and the semantic, semiotic together, right? That's what language does. Language connects it. Language connects my thinking to a material space, which allows you to work through it, okay, in different ways. Now, I think three factors influence language which we need to consider. One, of course, and the primary, I think, is sensory. Looking at the various sensory systems, visual, sound, touch, smell, taste. But not just that. As I said, we can't have sensory systems without people, users, your biographies, right? Each person is different in who they are, even twins, right? They're never the same, really, even though genetically they might be. Why? Because they're different biographically. Their life histories, their experiences are different. And because they're different, the language will be different. We should expect that. We should expect that variation to be very natural. If variation doesn't exist, it's a strange thing. We'll sound like robots. An episode from Black Mirror, maybe, or Star Trek, right? But we're biographical beings, and being biographical means that our sensory systems work through us, and we work in relation to each other. And the uses of the language. So what are the social semiotic processes that we are engaged in? What are we doing with language? Are we giving a lecture? Are we giving a talk? We're chatting with friends? We're at a pub? We're at a conference? We're in a classroom? We're with family? We're talking about our parents? We're talking about our ancestors? We're talking about children? We're doing some work? We are writing a paper? We are writing a novel? We are reading a poem? Every single use is a different social semiotic process. And each social semiotic process means that the kind of language that we do is different, right? So then language is an interface between the material and semiotic, where the three factors are sensory systems. Notice I'm not restricting it to just language, right? Because it's written text is just one of the visual. Oral text is just one of the sound. Music works with it as well, right? Users and semiotics. In terms of how you might want to place them in a relation of material to semiotic space, you can perhaps think of sensory systems are the closest to the material. Why? Because they allow us to operate in material world. They allow us to move around, touch things, see things, hear things, smell things. Then there are the users who do that, and then the uses which are much more semiotic, right? The uses can be much more semiotic. It impacts the material world. Right, so, yeah. Okay. I'm just taking a pause here. Okay. In case you didn't notice, I was taking a pause. Okay, so in some of my previous work, I've been sort of thinking about how do you map this language variation. And I'll show you a graphic that I've been using for a number of years now, and a lot of people have been using it for their work. I'm not happy with it any longer. But that's the nature of how our work develops. We change things. But I'll still share it with you because I think it still works. I'm not happy with it because I'll tell you why, but it doesn't matter. This system. So essentially what it does, it takes the users, the uses, and the sensory or the mode in relation to each other, and combines them to provide different ways of doing it. The reason I don't like it is because I've only got written and oral like text. I can put in more. This is already very difficult to show in a graph. Imagine if I wanted to show all 5 senses. Graphically it's very difficult. But I'm starting to work on how I might do it. But essentially what I'm saying is that you can think of how users interact with each other in terms of how close they are to each other or how distant they are. So how language varies. When you're talking to your siblings, your close friends, you use language in one way. When you use language with people you don't know really well, you use it differently. Okay. When you have people who have low social distance, you use a lot of slang, you have a lot of colloquialisms, you have lots of words of endearment, right? So if you think about you talking to your girlfriend or your boyfriend or somebody like, or your husband, wife, the kind of language, the intimate language you use is low social distance. But but if you meet some stranger on the street, you will not use the same language with them. Otherwise, you'll get into trouble, right? And if you use that high social distance language with people who are close to you, people will think you're upset about something or angry or mad. So variations along those lines. The sensory we have just talked about, whether it's written like or oral like. Notice I don't say written or oral, but written like, because so think of it this way: when you write a play, it's meant to be performed, but it's written down. So even though it's written, it's actually, the grammar is more oral-like. And then we can think of the uses, whether we have everyday casual uses of language or specialized and technicalized uses. And these are also continua, right? So you can talk about the weather system, you can talk about the weather thinking about it rained really hard last night, or you could be at a conference on environmental studies, and then you will talk about weather in a very different way, in a very technicalized, specialized ways, right? So in a conference on linguistics, we will use a lot of linguistic terminology, but if you are talking about language to your friends, you will not use the same terminology, it will change, right? So the use will change. But of course, all of these things come together. Oh, sorry. So we can actually combine these three systems, so we can create, sort of identify 8 different domains where we say local, right? So local as a user, oral, everyday, local, written, everyday, local, oral is specialized, local, written, specialized, global, oral, everyday, global, written, everyday, global, oral, specialized, global, written, specialized. Now, what I've also done here is I've told you where we study this in linguistics. Right, so local, oral, everyday is the stuff that we study when we do dialectology, when we do world Englishes and things like that. We do stuff when we're looking at written, local, written, everyday, we also do similar things, dialectology, world Englishes. But notice there's a huge gap when we look at local, oral is specialized and local, written is specialized. Those are the kind of descriptions of language we often don't have, because they're pretty typical, specialized for different communities. Now, all communities have this. Indigenous communities have this, because they need to work and operate in a system, right? For example, they cultivate, they have crops. They would have different terms for the different types of soils. They would have different terms for different types of weather patterns and rains patterns. They have a lot of technical knowledge, specialized knowledge, which is very locally grounded in the experience of the world that they live in as their community. But we often don't look at that as much. Which has consequences in how things develop. Now, when you look at global oral everyday and global written everyday, this is where a lot of the research happens. So English is a lingua franca, English is an international language, genre studies, prescriptive grammars, these sort of come from these domains 5 and 6. Then you have domains 7 and 8, and these are things like genre studies, English for specific purposes, language for specific purposes, and all that stuff comes together. Now, what this helps us to do is this module helps us to see how language variations exist in broad domains. Now, of course, within each of these domains, there are a number of sub-variations, and that's very hard to map out. But it does give you a sense of these variations across these things. Now, once we look at language as a semiotic system, and when we start looking at how variation sort of works across language, we can start looking at how perhaps the semiotic systems operate in different ways. So this is where I will have one more slide, and then I'm going to start to, actually, I'll have to ask them, no, I think, yeah. Okay, yeah. So we can think of 2 orders of semiotic systems. So I would call the first order of semiotic system any system that interfaces directly with the material space to create meaning. And that's what language does. The connection between the semiotic and the material space, connecting what people do semiotically with the material world. And it interacts both ways. It's not just one way. It's not just that we think and do things. Actually, what we experience in the world impacts our thoughts too. It goes both ways in different ways. But the first order of semiotic systems are those that indirectly interact with the material world. So spoken sounds interact with the material world. Written text interacts with the material world. But our thoughts, our beliefs do not, right? Touch does. If I touch something, I can feel it. It's a semiotic process that connects me with the material, right? But these semiotic systems, the first order of semiotic systems, don't tell us about our thought processes, our belief systems, what we believe in, what our cultural practices are. These are physical. All of us have these. Okay? And if we don't, we compensate for it through other sensory systems. But then we have a second order semiotic systems, which is social. Now, these systems draw on the first order of semiotic systems to exist. They cannot exist independent. And they may impact and be impacted by material space, but that can only happen through the first order semiotic systems. So think of it this way: cultural beliefs, religious beliefs, politics, economic theories, all these things, they're belief systems. For example, religion, right? Religion is physical, it's material in the way that we construct our architecture. If we pray, the movements that we have in our prayer, that's the material realization of a prayer. But that physical realization of the material is the first order semiotic system. Our belief about why we pray and what we pray and who we pray to are not material in the same way. They're socially constructed. That's why every while you move around the world, the same religion is practiced in different ways. You have different sects within a religion. You have different interpretations of religion, right? And the reason they're different across different spaces, material spaces, is because they're second order semiotic systems. They're not material, they're semiotic. We experience them through the material world by seeing things, right? When we grow, we see people doing things. So for example, if there's a traditional ceremony where there's a dance ceremony in a culture in a certain way, then the children will start seeing it as very young, and they will participate in it. But seeing is first order semiotic. Hearing is first order semiotic. What that means to us is second order. Now, this is very interesting. I think it's very useful. When you separate out first order semiotic systems from second order semiotic systems, we can start to appreciate how the material world and what we think are independent, and how the second order semiotic systems draw on first order systems to create them. Which means we can then, if we start working on how these interface with each other, then we can start thinking about how we can utilize this knowledge to create systems that operate more smoothly. Now, very often language experts and linguists and language teachers are seen pretty low on the totem pole of the hierarchy of different professions, right? So if you were to ask somebody, if I were to ask you who you think gets a higher salary on average, a medical doctor or a Bahasa Malay language teacher? You're laughing because it's not even a real question, right? But it is. The reason it is the way because it's in a sense we are seeing people who work around language are seen not as very high up in the professional hierarchies. But that's because we haven't shown the world that what we can do, right? Because we're stuck in the grammatical patterns of teaching nouns and verbs and subjects and adjectives. That's what we're stuck with. Teaching people how to write a paragraph or a sentence, rather than thinking about how the two orders of semiotic systems operate and can create a change in the world. How language creates the semiotic, second order semiotic spaces, and how a change in the language can change the semiotic space itself. Right? So it's not like the material and semiotic are independent, they're not. In the person, they are unified, and outside the person, they interact. So our semiotic systems, our beliefs impact what we do, and how we engage with other people, what we say, and how we say it, right? And the other way around. So if we think of language as not about a set of rules of grammar, adjectives and nouns and verbs, but we think of language as much more semiotically oriented, where semiotic systems themselves can be parsed in terms of first order and second order, where first order has the connection with materiality, and the second order has to use a first order to exist in itself. Then we start seeing how language and other semiotic, first order semiotic systems can be utilized to stabilize and harmonize societies and cultures and communities. Now, it's in the reason that medical doctors get a higher salary is not because they work harder than teachers. That's not the case. As you know, most of you who are teachers probably work harder. We work over the weekends grading papers, right? We wake up in the middle of the night with an idea, oh, I should change my slides or my lecture or do something else, right? We do all of these things. We work as hard as a medical doctor does, not less. But a medical doctor gets paid more because they are seen as doing something that is extremely useful to the society. Because your life depends on the doctor. Because if the doctor doesn't give you the right treatment, or if they're unhappy with you for some reason, right, things will go wrong with you. So therefore, we're willing to pay them. We don't see that with the teachers. And it's not because the teachers don't do it, it's because of the way that we don't encourage that kind of thinking about teaching. So if we change the way about teaching and we don't restrict ourselves to material spaces, but we also think about it in terms of semiotic spaces, then we can go further. Can I take off the slide projector for a second? So I'm going to try to put it all together. How much time do I have? 10 minutes? Okay. I'll do it, sorry, 15?
About 15.
About 15 minutes? All right, perfect. Oh. This.
Oh, and there's some things written on the board.
This okay? Okay. So this is a bit tricky. I'm still trying to visualize how to show these sort of things. So what I want to show though is this, that it is you with a smiley face that has to be theorized. Okay. We have to theorize based on you. You have eyes, you have ears, you have a mouth, right? You have hands. You have hands, right? Yeah, I'm not known for my great work of art. I should put some hair, otherwise you might think it's me. Well, there are no glasses. Okay. So that's the person, right? Now, what you see in this person is the material. You don't see the semiotic. So all I can see in all of you is just the material. I don't know what's going in your heads. There's no way I can ever do it. But there is something that's going here, right? So we know that there is a relationship between the material and the semiotic. Now, for this person to operate both ways, this person has sensory organs. So the person, which I write with all caps, person, has sensory organs, sensory systems, right? Which allows them to work through space and place. This person has a biography. And this person has a desire, goals, right? Each one of you. You have sensory systems, you have your biography, and you have your desires, your goals, your dreams, your ambitions, whatever it is that you want to achieve. All of this is part of you, of the person, right? So language then works in relation to these things, right? So in terms of language, we can think of language in terms of how our sensory systems operate. In specific, we can think of visual and or oral. But these sensory systems don't work in isolation. They work in relation to, and now I shouldn't draw these drawings, maybe I should just these sort of things. These waves, these are waves. These connect to a second order semiotic system. Right? So there is the sensory systems, which are the first order, and there are second order semiotic systems, which relate to your biography and goals. So what we then see in relation to the language is the relationship of semiotic systems, is the connectivity between the sensory systems of us as human beings and the first order semiotic systems, and how they interface with the second order systems, which then interface, relate back to our desires, our goals, and our biographies. It's all connected, right? And then we can think of how these sensory systems again operate in the context of a specific mode of language, say the writing system or the oral system, right? And that oral system then will be just oral language, which is then seen in terms of patterns and sequences and orders, which is what we typically think of grammar, right? So here, when it is that self, so you've got the person, you've got the two orders of semiotic systems, and then you have perhaps what we can call language here, which is the, again, in terms of the sensory input, is a particular type of a sensory system, but then there are patterns in which there can be intonation patterns, there is rhythm, there's rhyme, people who do phonetics, phonology, all that stuff comes in here, and looking at how those patternings work together. But then those patternings don't work by themselves, they again relate to the larger text, right? And the text comes back to the person here and goes back to the second order systems. So, and this, right? It's a messy drawing. That's why no way I can do it on a PowerPoint yet. But what I want to give you a capture here very briefly is how if we actually put the person at the center, we can still theorize language. There's no reason why we cannot have descriptions of language that are centered around the person, where the person is seen as the main, is the language, because there is no language without the person, right? But then associating and understanding it in terms of the sensory material world and the semiotic systems and the desires of how those operate across, and then how these things are interacted or relate with a very particular kind of sensory input that we receive. And all of it together then becomes language for us, or understanding of language. So for me, if we can pull this down. Oh, sorry. No. Yeah. So for me then, we have the person, that's the three-dimension sensory systems. We have the two orders of semiotic systems, and then we have language systems, perhaps different strata, the graphophonology, the signage, the lexicogrammar, the discourse semantics, how they interact with each other all the time. Now, by putting the person at the center and trying to re-theorize how meanings are not just material, how space is not only material, but space is both material and semiotic, we can go back to these images and look back at them and say, what's happening here? The class in Uganda is not just about the material space, but it's a semiotic space that is being constructed for these children in that place. And that's done through a number of different ways. It's all the 5 sensory systems. It's the first order semiotics and the second order semiotic systems. How we merge, how we create those, how we change those impacts everybody. We can look at the class in Pakistan and what happens there. Again, not just in terms of material space, but the semiotics of what's happening within that space. So the material space impacts the semiotics. So for example, compare these three, right? Let's compare Canada, a classroom in Canada, which is very similar to Sydney, to a class in Pakistan, right? So in terms of just the materiality, you can see, for example, there's much more space. Kids are walking around. Notice here, no space to move around. And I can show you, last year we were looking at pictures from Nigeria, where there are 200 kids in a small room with, there's not even space for a teacher to move through. There's just no space, right? So there is, of course, that material space you can look at, the movement that people will have. Now, if there is no mobility allowed to these kids and they're sitting there for 5 hours, it's tough. I can't sit, you can't sit for 5 hours in one place and listen to somebody, right? Here you have movement. But it isn't just the materiality of this space, but it's the semiotics of what that space allows us to create, right? The kind of relationships and engagement with knowledge that's happening here, you can almost see it's book to person to teacher. Here, it's kids together, doing things, lots of things to do. The very nature of how they're engaging with the world in this class is different. Here, it's purely text-based. Here, it's all 5 senses, right? There's movement, there is touch, there is, of course, sound and language, but there is expression. There is all 5 senses. Here, we reduce the number of senses because we are focused on language as text, as material. Okay? We learn things because we read things. Actually, we learn things because we do them. right? Reading helps. Of course, reading helps us a lot. But it's not the only thing that it is. By learning about things, by reading things, if we don't put them into practice, we really haven't learned anything. Would you go to a doctor who might have received 100 marks in every theoretical unit that they ever took, but when they have never done any practice? Right? Would you? No, right? I wouldn't. I don't think many of us will go to a doctor who has the degree but no experience. You want to go to an experienced doctor. Why? Because it's not just the reading that creates the knowledge, it's the experience. We know that. You won't want to have a lawyer defending you in a court of law who has never been in a court of law before. Right? Because that would not be good for you. So you will want somebody who's got a lot of experience. We know that. But when it comes to education, we sort of focusing just on the materiality of things, looking at language just as material as nouns and verbs, rather than thinking of it at multimodal, two levels of semiotic spaces, engaging with each other in different ways that make a difference. A child who will grow up here or here or here will have different ways of thinking and doing things. They will have different potentials. They will have different futures. Okay? So, or somebody who does this, online class, right, will be totally different again. Right? So it isn't just the materiality, it's the semiotic space that makes it's important. And I think that's something we really need to work on as language experts, as language teachers and educators, bringing the person to the center. Thinking about the human experience and the human that we are dealing with. We're not dealing with language, it's not an entity that exists outside us. We're dealing with us. And therefore we have to think about the implications of what it means when we're dealing with other people and how it comes together. So sort of just towards concluding this, we can think about that it is not simply enough to talk about space in relation to pedagogy. We need to understand what the word space can mean in relation to both material and, I would argue, semiotic spaces. Semiotic spaces are probably even more important. Material and semiotic spaces interact with each other through human agency. Right? So when I talk about the person and their desires and their dreams, I'm also talking about their agency. Humans have the agency of doing things. When we reduce language to text and take away the agency out of it, and the ability of people to do things and manipulate things and move around the world, then we are decreasing their agency. So we can, one thing to talk about, how much agency do we provide, give or encourage in our students in the programs that we teach in? Do we give them the agency to do things on their own, independent? Or do we constrain them by rules and regulations of grammar and how things should be done? If we encourage agency, which is encouraging the person will do things. If we tell the person that you can only do things this way because everything else is wrong, then you're limiting their agency. Again, that means that we have to think about the implications of thinking about understanding language and semiotics to education to empower these children and our communities. Changes in material and or semiotic spaces impact the kind of meanings that we create and how we make them. And pedagogical space includes dimensions of both material and semiotic spaces. And finally, changes in material pedagogical space impacts and is impacted by semiotic pedagogical space and vice versa. Meaning that it's not about where we are, but it's about what semiotic processes do we engage with and how do we socially negotiate that. That's what empowers us. And so that's what I would think is something we need to consider as we move on into the next generation of doing linguistics. Thinking about application first, thinking about the person first, not grammar first, not theory first. Our questions don't need to be grounded theoretically. They need to be grounded in the communities. Okay? And when you change that, we change the very nature of the discipline. And there is, as I said, I've got a lot of problems with how linguistics operates as a discipline, but we don't need to keep thinking about what the problems are. We need to think about alternative ways in which we can conceptualize language and linguistics to empower the communities and the people rather than limiting them by creating reference points. Okay. That's all, guys. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you so much to